On Twitter. I'm Martha Bruckner from Council Bluffs, Iowa. I know nothing about technology, but if you tweet, here's what you need to use as a hashtag. Hashtag #, NATL stands for National, SUPT stands for Superintendents, RD Table, all one word, lowercase, hashtag SUPT, no, NATL, SUPT, RD, table, all one word, and then you'll find there's 2 comments about all of the learning we're having, and then that will get all of your followers on Twitter to know where we are and about this wonderful conference.
Martha and others came up to me and asked me if we had a tweet account. In fact, we do, but I can't remember how to get to it, so they created one just for this conference. I want to say 2 things before we introduce our next speakers. First, thanks to NYU, this conference is being streamed, and it is available at the NYU site, and I sent you the link earlier, and after the conference is over, I will send it to you again. The reason I'm mentioning that is that if any of you want your school boards, your principals, your teachers to see what we've been exposed to here today, you can hook them up with that stream because it's going to be available online and share it with them. So I'll send that out to you again. And the second thing I want to say before introducing our speakers is that NYU invited several people from outside our community to join us here. We're just delighted to have them. And I see at least 2 of them are still with us. We may have driven the 3rd one out. So if they wouldn't mind standing and telling us who they are, we are thrilled to have you here. We've got 3 people. Good.
My name is Cesar Hussein. I'm an Education Pioneers Fellow this year, which means I don't have a background in education, but I'm learning throughout this fellowship program. So I'm really excited. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Hello, my name is Melissa Fernandez. I'm delighted to be here. I'm actually passionate about education. I've taught in Guatemala, and I also taught in a high school in D.C. So I'm really much enjoying being here. I'm Maria Rubin. I'm an education writer and currently a teacher at Football Friends School, and I'm a graduate student at Washington University.
So thank you all very much. We're very pleased to have you here. So now that we know everything there is to know about education in France, we're about to learn everything we need to know about education in England. Last year, when we went on that forced march through Europe, 2 of the people that we heard that made a huge impression on all of us were Sue Hackman and Sir Peter Burkett. And Sue has recently retired. She insists that she's of retirement age, but I don't believe her. She's the former chief advisor on school standards at the Department of Education in England. And for those of you who think I made a mistake in writing down England as opposed to Great Britain, I did not make a mistake. The system in Great Britain is divided up amongst the various principalities that England claims as their own. So Sue was only responsible for England and not for Wales, Scotland, or the north of Ireland.
It would have been better there if I had been.
It would have been, yes. So she was chief advisor on school standards to several secretaries of state at the Department of Education between 2006 and 2013. She was responsible for accountability, assessment, inspection, school improvement, pedagogy, catch-up programs, international education, and deprivation, as well as core subjects. Prior to joining the department, she was the national director of the national strategies under the last government, which I take it would be the Blair or Brown government. Blair and Brown. Her experience as a teacher, okay, and you're going to see when she starts speaking, you know she's been a teacher, spans all key stages. She started her career as a secondary English teacher. She also worked as an advisor in a local authority for several years. That would be an LEA. She's an experienced school inspector and a well-known writer with over 80 titles. So if Sue would start, and then when you're finished, I'll introduce Sir Peter.
Thank you. Now, thank you. Even I'm looking forward to hearing what I have to say after that. What I'm planning to do, 4 things. I'm going to talk about the facts of life of managing education in England at the moment. Secondly, where we were when this government was elected, policy since the last election, and then what we've learnt over the last few years. Jim did ask me to come and talk about the policies of the Cameron government. Of course, it isn't quite the Cameron government.
You might turn off the one at your neck, because I think there's a microphone on your phone.
Feedback. Okay.
Is this one on? Yes.
You want me to? I'll stand here then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right then. I'm staying fixed here.
Let's get this out of the way.
Okay. There we go. Of course, we've got a coalition government. This was the part where I was going to lecture you about the difficulties of running an education system when you have 2 parties who think they're in charge. But I see I don't have to tell you much on this score, except to say as a civil servant it was very challenging, but I expect you guessed. It was fantastic at the beginning, because after the election they got together and agreed on a small number of top priorities they were going to pursue. You know, that there was going to be autonomy of schools, we were going to give lots of money to deprived children, etc., etc. And having 6 priorities was fantastic. From my point of view, I knew what I was doing. I had an agenda. Oh, it was wonderful. Well, that was the first 3 days sorted. After that, real life set in, life happened, things changed, issues came up for which there was no agreement. That took time to go back to the parties to find an agreement, then they couldn't reach an agreement. You'd think there would be a lot of compromise. In fact, I don't think there was. There were a lot of deals struck. We'll give you summer schools if you'll give us more money for academies, that kind of deal. And what it meant was, around this very firm initial core of policies, there is an aurora of rather disparate and piecemeal policies have evolved. So there you are, working with coalition, it takes up a lot of time. And we've got a recession, it's deep and it's hard in England. I think we've got it worse than you, actually. There's no money to do anything. And so a new government has to make a virtue of having no money by deregulating, devolving and cutting everything and giving schools freedoms. In fact, all activity was curtailed pretty much, except for two priorities. One was to protect the baseline budget that went into schools, and the other was the creation of autonomous schools, that is the creation of what we would call academies, you might call charter schools, and some other variants on it, for example the studio school, which Peter will perhaps talk about, and free schools, but essentially autonomous schools. In fact, only 2 things get protected in England when times hard. One is education and the other is our National Health Service. Both are cherished by the political parties, and in that sense we are very lucky, I think. Well, here they are. Here are the ministers who are running education. One's already changed since I loaded the picture on the PowerPoint. We get through them at a rate of knots in education. One of the biggest problems, we have 5 years of government, but honestly one of our big problems is continuity. You know, politicians are elected, they want to make a splash in 2 or 3 years before they're gone. And in fact, about 18 months was the uppermost I'd experienced until Gove came and stayed. Gove, there he is, red arrow, journalist. The one that's gone is the one over his right shoulder. He's a lord, of course, not elected, but you always have a lord amongst your ministers. We've got a new lord now, specially created for the job. The lady, Elizabeth Truss, is the only one of them that had an education in state schools. I was a very senior civil servant. Among the small group of people who basically ran education back there, there were only 2 of us who'd been in state schools at any point in our lives. So we have the curiosity in England that the state system is run by public. You understand that public schools in England are private schools, so independent commercial schools. So the other thing that you might want to know is that we've got a general election in 18 months and we are playing in the second half, and it will be difficult with the coalition, I think, because inevitably each party wants to make clear its own policies, where it agrees, where it disagrees. I think that's going to make it quite tricky during the last year as they want to campaign for their own policies. It's going to. I think not much will change in the coming months. I want to talk a little bit about the way we were when the government got elected 3 years ago, because there had been 13 years of Labour government, that is 3 elections that they'd won, and education had been a centrepiece policy. When Blair was asked, when he first got elected in 1997, what are your top 3 priorities, his answer famously was education, education and education. How fantastic was that for an educator? I've got to say, at first it was quite easy. It didn't feel easy at the time. Looking back, I realise it was easier than it felt. It was in a bad way. I've got to say, standards were low. Teaching in particular was poor and had no development money for ages. Leadership was mediocre in schools, but there was a national curriculum and national assessment which had been introduced by a previous Conservative government. Now, this is what Gove inherited. He inherited, sorry, I'm already lost. Did I miss my slide? No. It was an accountability heaven in England at the time. If you're an enthusiast about accountability, and I am an enthusiast about accountability, I do believe when you spend taxpayers' money, you should be accountable for what you do with it. If some schools with the same intake can get fantastic results, while other schools with the same sort of intake are not getting the same results, I do think you should bring pressure to bear. Accountability, it is uncomfortable. It is. Nobody likes to be inspected, nobody likes data which exposes you, but I do believe in accountability in public services. But I've got to say, at that point, when the Conservatives were elected, if it moved, we measured it and held schools accountable for it. We assessed at ages 5, 7, 11, 14, 16 and 18. We had national tests, a series of levels through which pupils passed from year 1, when they enter school, up to the start of their public examinations when they're 14 years old. We set targets for every school, all schools. We set a bottom line of how many pupils you should get to expectations. That was for primary schools, defined in terms of English and mathematics results, and it was 55% of pupils should make it. We set targets for people like you that would make your eyes water. They did, indeed. We set targets for ethnic groups. We set targets for free school meals pupils. We published league tables. We measured progress as well as attainment. We inspected every school regularly with a team of inspectors on the spot. Every school had a school improvement partner sent by you, people like you in England, to help them to improve and look at what they were doing. We did PISA, we did PIRLS, we did TIMSS. Oh, to be a city-state like Singapore. And anyway, when did Shanghai, since when has Shanghai become a country? It's a city, isn't it? I said to the Secretary of State, I know what we'll do. We'll find some leafy English city like, say, Richmond upon Thames, and we'll send in their results, like the Shanghai results. They can be the English results. Send in Richmond upon Thames. We will beat everybody in the world if it was Richmond upon Thames, because the parents do such a good job there. I'll tell you what PISA's like in England. We have 2 days of perfect storm, when they say you've slipped down the tables. And then after that, the bit you should be looking at, and the bit would be more interesting to you than where, because, you know, every year has different people in it, doesn't it? There's different countries in there. It's the attitudinal data from the international comparisons, the attitudinal data is what's interesting. For example, our reading results have declined in proportion to the number of hours pupils spend on social media, such as Facebook or at the computer, where children used to go home and read novels. Now they go home and they're on Facebook or whatever it is they do. Oh, games, computer games, of course. But the attitudinal data is tremendously helpful. And so we don't rush to put aside, we own the data. Can I tell you, we try to conduct ourselves with in a no excuses way, that we own the data that comes from the international comparisons. I wanted to just mention this. This is like the scribbled notes in my margin to say to you. After last night, we did adjust for 3 years our results for poverty, and it was by free school meals, broadly speaking. And then we stopped doing it. The reason we stopped doing it was that it made some schools complacent. That when there were schools in poor areas, they said, well, you know, we were doing rather well, Sue, given the parents we have. And that's complacency. Because when you go buy a car, and does the dealer say to you, this car goes at 10 miles an hour, and when you consider the parental background of the people who made it, that's a bloody good car. You say, no, I want my car to purr like a kitten and drive at 100 miles an hour. You want a car that works. You don't want to say to your working class children, do you, that our standards for you, we know, do you? Our standards for you are down here. The other children, the one with the nice parents, they're up there, but you know, this is good for you. You want the best for your child, no matter what your income is. And so, although you must have the data, and we still collect the data, we don't put it in our accountability regime because we fear that it encourages lower standards for the less well-off. And I think you should be careful that that doesn't happen to you, because that is what happened to us. And so we stopped doing that. The targets were a pain in the neck. We set targets for schools, for people like you. Every level I had targets as well. We use the word aspirational. Do you use that word? It's a kind of code word for very hard indeed. They were pretty unattainable. But what happened was, every year our results went up. We did have fantastic success. Every year our results went up. But every year the press crucified us because we didn't make the targets. Our results went up, but we were crucified by the press because we didn't make the targets. And that was one of the things that this government, when it was elected, wanted to get itself off the targets exposure. But I can tell you that we did the statistics to look at what schools actually did achieve, and the schools that set themselves aspirational targets and didn't meet them did better than the schools that set themselves realistic targets and did meet them. And I think there might be quite an important lesson there, that if you reach and you aspire, you're going to do better than if you set yourself quite a low threshold. There had been a massive investment in, my slides are in the wrong order. This is age 11. This isn't what you want to see when you come into government. This was the record of the previous government. It's a pretty good record, I think. Results went up over 20% in the period. These were the glory years. This is fantastic. You know, the results went up. Fantastic. They had got a target of 80% of pupils making it to expectations. And we did finally make that about 5 years too late, but we did make it in the end. But I do remember when we said we want all your children, even in the poorest schools, even in the downtown East End, we're expecting you to get 80%. They said, we can't do that. Do you know what kind of kids we've got here? Do you know how many immigrants we've got without any English? Do you know how many children come here without any food in their bellies or shoes on their feet? They made it. In the end, they made it. And that is important to know too, that at first people say it can't be done, but actually, very often it can. These were the horrendous years. That's the 3-year flat line. It was terrifying. Because what we did at the beginning was we plucked the low-hanging fruit. Those that could move and would move, moved. but those that weren't up for it didn't. And during this period, it was although it was frightening, it was also very productive, because what we did data, because we didn't understand why, despite all our best efforts, our sincerest efforts, and throwing loads of money at it, things weren't moving. And what we did is we did the data. We looked at every single ethnic minority was measured for over a long period, and how they were progressing and what they attained. At first, people said, oh, it's bound to be the kids who've just arrived with no English, or it's bound to be that ethnic group or this ethnic group who are very poor. In fact, it turns out the ethnic groups were doing a lot better than the white working class. And if you want to put your finger right on it, the white working class boy is our national problem. We have some ethnic groups that perform very badly indeed. The Turkish boys regress. We actively uneducate them in England. Somalians do pretty badly too. Some do, our Caribbean girls do fantastic in primary and then slump back in secondary. But that was important to look at the data, not just ethnic minority. We looked at free school meals, ethnicity, and we learned where our problems were. And that is where the rises then came from for the rest of that period. It depends how you feel about 1% a year. These rises are 1% a year on average. I believe in 1% a year. Politicians want 5%. But I believe as a teacher in 1% a year. I think 1% a year is a real rise. I believe in it, and you can hold on to it. Because holding on to rises is as hard, isn't it? Because it's a new cohort that you have to secure those rises with. But it was a hard slog. We had to learn new things, and roughly, and I don't think we've finished this by a long chalk, it's poverty. Gender has a big factor, ethnicity, or rather English as an additional language has a big factor. But it's poverty in England and class differences that create the big gaps. There was a massive investment in schools. My budget at the time of the election was £2.7 billion. That's over and above running costs. That was additional money that I had for driving up school standards. You had a field force. In England, people like you had a field force of experts in English, maths, science, teaching and learning, ethnic minority. You had resources to do it. We threw resources at it. Extensive training for teachers in service. Big programme for schools that fell below our floor, our bottom line standards, and every school had it was expensive. But it was producing at least some improvement. This is what it looked like on the day of the election. Every dot is a primary school, that's age 11, their results at age 11. And on this axis here, on this axis on the left, is attainment in English and maths, how many children make it to expectations. And on this axis are the children who make the going rate of progress. That is, children are adding, no matter what their starting point, they're adding the going rate of progress. They're making the amount of improvement that you'd expect. And what you get is quite a wide distribution. It'd be interesting for you to try this in your schools and make a scattergram the same. Up there, we love those schools. They're making great progress, they're improving, and they're getting great results, both raw results and progress results. We use those schools to help the rest. They're where your good practice and your support comes from. But we also had schools up here who were getting high results. On the surface of it were high-performing schools. These are schools that parents want to get their children in the localities. But the progress is less than it should be. They're not getting even the national average rate of progress. That line there is the average rate of progress. This line here is the average attainment, that is raw results. So you can see they're above national standards on the surface, but when you look at what they're doing, what their kids are getting, they should be doing so much better. They're coasting schools. Some of them are in the leafy, lovely parts of England. Down here, we have some schools who are below the floor. And up to the time we did this data, we were on their tail. But in actual fact, you see, although their results are low, when you look where their children started, they're adding a lot of value to them. And so that's one of the really lovely things about progression data, is that it can give you credit where credit's due. And I like this mix of absolute standard and progress. Is the school adding value? I'll just say, while I'm here, that this group in the middle, they were above the floor. That's our floor line. The blue bubble says some inconsistency. And what I'm saying is, in the sandwich between average attainment and the floor standard, those were schools that were largely inconsistent. They were wobbly schools, schools that were in crisis, schools without staff, schools without head teachers, schools with weak head teachers, schools that had had really bad Ofsted inspection. They were in tailspin. There are a lot of wobbly schools. It's interesting that they were all in that band. So that's the kind of data that we were doing, and then we began to devise a more targeted school improvement strategy. I thought you might just like to see our secondary diagram. It's rather flatter, but it's roughly the same story. Those ones up there are, we've got grammar schools in some areas of the country, which is the top 20% of pupils, so that accounts for some of those. We had a system of school improvement at that point, which the government had to consider, which was not unlike Dante's Inferno. You know, there were schools that were coasting. They got great results, but we knew that their kids they weren't adding enough value. And so we worked a kind of persuasion strategy. We had them all out. This was a really good thing to do. This worked really well, actually. It was a kind of persuasion strategy. We had out the head teacher, the school improvement partner, which was I've mentioned, and their chair of governors, like a parent governor, come out. And we told them that, would it surprise you, they didn't know that their progression rates were poor. They didn't know they were coasting. They didn't look at their data, and I thought that was quite revealing. However, down in the bottom 9th layer of hell were the schools that were below the floor and not improving and producing poor progress and had lousy results. And you'll find this very hard. They found it very hard. There were around 400 at that point. We said, you've got 2 years, or we shut you down, or we remove your head teacher and the governing body, or we reopen you, give you a fresh start, reopen you under new management. And we named and shamed them. It was a very controversial policy. It was called the National Challenge. Them down, and we did. But today, the vast majority of that 400 are above the floor. A few did get changed, quite a lot that hadn't made enough progress converted to academies in the end. We put them under new management, but it did work. And here's the thing about accountability, it's uncomfortable, but it does work, you see. At a certain point and well positioned in time and place, putting pressure on schools does deliver some results. This didn't work. It did in a way. The top line is most pupils. The bottom line is free school meal pupils. So it's a poverty indicator. I'm very proud of this, that we did move in this time. We did move from, I'm sorry, I'm struggling with the microphone. We did move from 45% up to 67%. And part of me says that's 22% more poor pupils make it to expectations. I'm proud of that. That was my life's work. You know, that is what I came into education for. I'm proud of it. What I'm not proud of is that gap there, which is still 18 percentage points between those on free school meals and the rest. perhaps I'm being a bit hard on myself because this gap is closing. What's happened is, as their results went up, the other children, their results were going up too. This gap, if we carried on closing the gap at the rate we're closing it, about 0.5% a year, these two lines will meet finally over somewhere near the White House, and we'll all be dead by then. And if your child's in school, you don't want to hear it. So I wish now that I couldn't persuade a single minister to take free school meals as a serious accountability target. It's always published, but none of them, because I think they know, you have to know what to do about it, don't you? Having data is brilliant, but data only points you the way you've got to go. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. And so it has its limitations. What would you do if you were a government with that situation, with fantastic rises in results, gaps beginning to close? Where would you take it? And you have no money. That is a difficult proposition. I think you've got to say, and even I had to say, probably pursuing pedagogical standards in the way we had wasn't going to produce much more. We'd plucked the low and middle hanging fruit by then. And so government had to look to something different. And remember, these are Liberals and Conservatives. So it had to be something that they could both agree on. Roughly, they have pursued a very permissive ideology. We've had aggressive deregulation of everything about schools, almost a theology of autonomy, that making schools autonomous will in itself succeed. And the less bossing around by the state, but nonetheless I'd say a small but very powerful state left behind. There was a bonfire of targets. They threw everything into the Academies programme to create autonomous schools and reduced accountability measures. You know, I told you about all the accountability measures. Reduced them down, right down to a few, but raised the bar. Interesting. Fewer accountability measures, less work to do, but they hiked up standards that you had to reach. Less is more, they said. Less is also cheaper, incidentally, which was a good thing. School improvement cash, that £2.7 billion I had decentralised, and it all went into backing up the school budget. I had 30 million left after the election. They stripped out the middle tier in the early days. People in your position in England are a very miserable bunch. I spoke to them about 3 months ago. Their conference was glummer than yours. A lot of the money that the money and the regulatory powers that they have been stripped away. And they've been left with some very basic tasks to do, like making sure every child has a school place, and even that is tough. People in your position have lost, probably been the biggest losers in the education system and in the recession in England. Taking out the middle tier, as it stands, has been a big part of policy. Do you have the word quangos? Do you have quangos in America? Do you know what quangos are? No. They're like close to government bodies. They're not government bodies. They're supposed to be independent, but they're not really. They're very close. We have them for assessment. We have them for school food. We have them for curriculum experts. We had them for regional. We had hundreds of them, and they got rid of that part of the middle tier too. Sorry?
What does Quango stand for?
I don't know that it stands for anything other than it's a non-government. It's a body that's created by government but isn't part of government. It's very convenient when things go wrong. This has resulted in a kind of battle for the middle tier. Who runs the middle tier? The ground that was occupied by some local authority, some people in your position have set up self-funding school improvement, and their schools have bought into it. Primary schools, not secondary. In secondary, the academy chains, you know, the new independent schools, they're doing some of that work. We have a lot of freelance consultants running round, but they are the ones who were running around under the last government. I don't know that they're saying much new, and I don't know if that is quite what government had in mind. Interestingly, in England, a number of very big companies have backed out and don't think they can make the school improvement market pay. And in a recession, they might be right. There is not a lot of spare cash in schools once you've paid your teachers. However, there are smaller and innovative companies, and I think, and movements and ideas beginning. Do you know you know what happens when there's a vacuum? New flowers start to bloom, and there is the beginning of that. But it is a bit of it's a bit of a desert. School improvement's a bit of a desert, and there is scrapping and fighting over who's running the middle tier. At this point in time, over half of our secondary schools are now academies, and 7% of our primary schools. They enjoy the freedoms that I've listed on there. However, they still have Ofsted inspections. They still have to do the national curriculum tests. They still have their data published like everybody else. And so their freedoms, I'd say, are quite limited by the accountability regime. There's only so far you can go in your curriculum if in the end you're sitting the same test that everybody else is sitting. Do you see what I mean? That it will limit what you can actually do with the freedoms. Nonetheless, standards are rising in academies at the rate of 7.8 in the last 2 years, compared with 4.5 in all schools. So almost twice the rate of improvement. Can I just say that a lot of them, they do need to rise. They've got room to rise. They weren't doing well. It was obviously, the academies have been largely forged from schools that had a lot to do. And so they should be getting those kind of rises. But it is a successful policy. Not every school is succeeding, not every academy. We worry a bit about chains and groups of schools that are brilliant at the beginning, and then they get bigger, and there's less, I don't know what it is, the fire and enthusiasm that sets up a chain of schools, it's just gets spread very thin. And the later converts don't do as well as the early converts. And I think there might be something about the size of, we're very interested, we watch American, like KIPP, we watch charter schools in America and see some of the similar patterns there. The government have also reintroduced very traditional, we found our inspiration for this, ministers came ready, they knew what they wanted. From the Hirsch curriculum in Massachusetts, which is why I was very interested in what Mr. Ash was saying last night. It is a content-based curriculum. We had a very skills and process-based curriculum until now. And this is back to a kind of content. We've established an English baccalaureate, which means passing in secondary school English, maths, science, history or geography, and a modern foreign language. And modern foreign languages have recently been expanded to include those well-known modern foreign languages, Latin and Greek. And taken out of the equation have been art, sociology, media studies, and sadly many vocational qualifications. Almost all of them have gone. So they don't count in the accountability regime. And that has been a contentious with the profession. It's been contentious. Assessment suite has been revised, is in the process of being revised. We're back to pen and paper tests, the end of coursework and practical tests. And also levels. You know, I mentioned to you about how in England children progress through levels between age 5 and age 14 so that we can measure progress. Levels are going in favour of a year-by-year knowledge-based assessment and rank order. We had rank order in the 50s and 60s. In other words, we're moving from absolute criteria to relative ranking. And I think the ramifications of that are going to be enormous when they come in 2 years' time. The level of expectation has been raised by a whole level. So the whole standard, I won't be able to show you graphs the year after next because the standard is being changed and it is being hiked up. And where have we got it from? Our new standard and our new curriculum. We went and looked at the world's curriculum. We studied the world's curricula and we took the most challenging standards from the most successful states. There's a lot of Pacific Rim in the maths curriculum, but we have recalibrated in order to raise expectations. We've also introduced a new phonics test for age 6 to try to secure reading results in the face of dropping results under PISA. We have a leaner accountability regime. We used to inspect every school every 4 years. Over time, we have evolved that, and now schools are inspected. We send people in when the schools seem to be regressing or falling below a certain line, or they haven't been inspected for a long time. So we don't treat all schools equally. If they're continuing to do well and getting good results and great progress, we leave them alone for longer. So proportionate inspection has come in. But we have hiked up standards in that as well. And the floor target, again, this has not been popular. I told you we had floor targets where we say this is the government's bottom line. You below this line, you have got a problem. You should not be below this line. No school should be below here. We now have a rising floor that we redefine the bottom line. So it is higher now. So it was 30 on the secondary graph. It's now 35 since that graph was done. Ofsted, which is our inspection, changed. This is interesting. This is something we learned actually. 4 is better than 5. We had when schools were judged, the overall point was satisfactory, which became a euphemism for not really very satisfactory at all, and everybody knew that. And 4 points gets you off the fence. So inspectors now say either it's an excellent, outstanding school, it's a good school, or it requires some improvement. May not be huge amounts, but it requires some improvement. In other words, if you're not good, you're not good enough. So we don't tolerate mediocrity anymore. I think that's the gist of it. Gosh, that's been hard. Schools have found that hard. Where they have been satisfactory in the past, they're now requiring improvement. And when a parent hears the requiring improvement term, they are more cautious then about their attitude. Big money has gone into schools. The pupil premium for free school meals, armed forces, children in care. And it's going up. It will in due course be over £1,000 when, as it's planned in the budget, but this is what it stands at today. So for every child with free school meals, in a school, in other words, impoverished, you get an extra £600, which is around $1,000. And coming soon, we're going to publish every single bit of data we've ever... sorry, I missed that out. We're going to publish the mother of all comparative data tools. Even you will be entitled to go on it. We are publishing absolutely everything. I think this is a good move. Researchers will love us. In truth, the real reason is that 20% of my staff's time on school standards was spent answering freedom of information requests. And that isn't what we should be doing with our, these very bright minds we have in the civil service. I like the idea of free data that everybody can tinker with and look for patterns in. So more people, like last night's speaker, can root around and find interesting patterns that we can discuss and reflect on. There has finally been a much greater emphasis on school-to-school support and peer-to-peer support, using those schools that I showed you in the top right-hand quadrant to go into schools that are struggling. And what you get is, you get a school like you. You don't get somebody from the leafy Richmond-upon-Thames come to you down in the East End and tell you how to run your school. You get somebody from a school like yours who's doing really well to come and help you in your school who has had similar experiences. I think that was a real breakthrough of giving you support from people like you with your experience is much more credible. We do have a National College for School Leaders, which has led the way. I've not spent a lot of time on this today, but that is worth looking at. Okay, this is very personal. Obviously, I've spent, since 1997, I've worked with ministers, with all political parties. So this is just my selected highlights of what I think's worked. These are things we've learned. First is standards. I tell my staff this. Standards are always in fashion. Sometimes governments are less interested in standards than they perhaps ought to be, but the parents want standards. You ask a parent what they want anywhere in the world, they want their children to be happy at school, they want their children to do really well at school, and if they're working class, they will also add, I want strong discipline, I want an orderly school. And the public are very happy in England to welcome charter schools and academies, as long as their children are happy, do well, and it's an orderly environment. And in the same way, the public's happy to have a new curriculum, as long as their children are happy, do well, and it's an orderly environment. I'll just pop in as an aside, we did have a digital strategy, Francois. Have you been to it? Where's from? We were in it. We had a digital strategy, and we do have fabulous equipment in schools. It was a hardware strategy, and it didn't really produce results, not academic results. So I'd just say I would have paid more attention to the pedagogy if we were to rerun it. We also have 2-year-olds. Now, I recently had to go to the Education Select Committee, like what is the equivalent in? You have an equivalent, you know, where you have to go and answer to the big politicians for what you're doing, and terrifying. The 2-year policy, we did just the same thing. It was for deprived youngsters who we thought that will help. In fact, it was a big pastoral success. The kids loved it. They were much more attuned to schools, but it's not shown as they've come through to age 7, our testing points at 7 and 11. We can't see the impact. I say this with great sadness because we had high hopes of particularly of the early years strategy, but I do think it's worth keeping tabs on what the rest of the world, because we put a huge amount of money into it and we were disappointed. The other thing I've learned is that structural solutions are not in themselves enough. You can put the name charter on the board outside, but it doesn't mean that things inside will change. Being an academy is no guarantee that you're going to do well, but I do think recreating schools as autonomous does put them in a place where they can improve. It positions them where they can and do have a better chance of improvement. What works, if you want it in a nutshell, I'd say a great new head teacher. I'd say, do you know we went through a period in England when we had hero head teachers? We sent in the hero head teachers and they got their Superman costumes on and went and rescued a school. And it didn't really work terrifically well. So I'd like to amend the hero head teacher model. You need to send in a hero head teacher, and you know, Batman needs a few Robins with him. You need to send in a group of people, a head teacher with 4 loyal, like-minded, clever staff. They can change the world. You need a group of people in a school. The academies have been very good. We have monstrously large, well-meaning amateur governing bodies in England. And the academies have been much more business-minded, swept them away and had small, more expert governing bodies. They got in people who were to be treasurers, who were in the financial world. They were much more challenging, and they've worked much better. I thought I might just show you this. So you can have the slides afterwards, but these are Ofsted grades for governance, for governing bodies, against the results of the school's overall success, the school's overall Ofsted success. And you don't need to be a mastermind to see that there's a very strong correlation between a successful governing body and a successful school. A governing body that is data aware and asks challenging questions and is still supportive is a fabulous governing body. I think probably we ought to shrink our governing bodies, and this won't be popular. I'd quite like to pay them, because they're not paid in England, and I think maybe we need more expertise in there. Head teacher is a precious thing, you have to spend it wisely. We can't recruit enough head teachers in England. To be a head teacher in England, you put yourself on the line. You know, your school results go down, that's your reputation on the line as well. And so we've seen the growth of, and Peter's going to talk about this, executive groups of schools with one head between them. Makes a lot more economic sense in some with smaller schools, and it's a good career path. But executive head teachers is a great way to go. But overall, we've learned that data is the driver. Don't turn your nose up at data. Data's hard, it bears interpretation. There's not one data set, there's many. Don't turn your back on data though. Data is the driver. If you can get past the gosh moment, oh gosh, look at that. Like, oh gosh, look at the Turkish boys. They're regressing. Yes, and they are. And so what do you do with the Turkish boys? You know, what next? Do you send an ultimatum to the English department? Make the Turkish boys progress or else? You know, you've got to know what to do next. If you understand the data, because not everybody gets it, but it's the what to do next, I'd say, is the big thing. Progression data tells a different story. I have alluded to it. I'll tell you what we did and what you can do is I was an English teacher and we had 10% of all pupils didn't reach expectations, but who had left primary school above expectations. 10% of all pupils in England had left primary school above expectations. So the blue characters here, they passed their GCSEs, but the green ones didn't. They were near misses, they got Ds. 1% of them had actually been in the top drawer. They'd been well above expectations when they left primary school, and the other 9% had been at expectations. What happened to them? Well, we recruited some people and sent them into school, and we did focus groups and we asked the pupils. They actually hadn't progressed at all. We found out that the lack of progression had happened in Key Stage 3, which is it's about age 12, 13 that the rot set in, where they'd lost it, the drive, the motivation to learn. And when we asked them, do you know that you were stuck? They knew they were stuck and they were mortified. The pupils said it's not that they disliked school, but they came to school because that's what you do. They do it for other people. But they were bored. They didn't have the learning bugs. It felt to them like they were going through the motions. They felt that they were doing, they weren't learning for themselves. They were learning for other people, for their teachers, for their parents. But they weren't self-motivated. They had very strong opinions about other pupils, about the more stable. And the more stable, they get taken off on master classes. If they're naughty, they get the teacher's attention. If they're not very clever, they get put in catch-up groups and get extra. What do we get? We, the average. What about we neglect it? They didn't say it in those terms, but they felt neglected. When we said to their teachers, we interviewed an English or maths teacher afterwards, we said to the teachers, why don't they get extra attention? The teacher said, reasonably enough, well, when they arrived from primary school, they were at expectations. They're the normal children, they're the middle run. They were the ordinary children. Aren't we supposed to be providing things for the top end and bottom end? And so they weren't providing. They said they're the ones the curriculum's designed for. Which seems to me a completely reasonable thing to say. But these kids were feeling neglected. You can imagine we went in with clipboards with questions we were going to ask them. And they answered one question, a majority of them, and it wasn't even in our list of questions. So you've got to pay attention then, don't you, when you get a majority answer to a question you've not even asked. And the answer was, we want mentors. Why can't we have people? They didn't call them mentors, but we want somebody who pays attention to us, you know, somebody who we talk about. They didn't want bleeding hearts. They didn't want to talk about their personal problems. They didn't want to talk about their family problems. They wanted to talk about the work. Somebody who'd help me with hard homework, someone to talk about me and my work. They went off the rails at year 8, which is about age 12 to 13, and especially the boys became chatterboxes. Sometimes they began to truant, not from school, but from lessons. And when we looked at these kids, we went to the ones below them, the pink ones, who were 2 levels below par, and who'd always been 2 levels below par. Children who'd always been 2 levels behind. You know the ones I'm talking about? Because I bet you've got them too. They've always been trailing behind, those children. And we got those in focus groups and asked them the same questions. There's about 5 or 6% of them. They said they were very different. They were really talkative, for one thing. They were used to adults because they'd been in catch-up with adults since the year dot. They were better friends with adults than they were with children. They were completely open about their poor attainment. They described themselves as being not very clever. And we were even quite jolly about it. Not disturbed by it at all. They put a lot of energy into avoidance and concealment strategies. They're the ones who turn up with no homework because the dog has eaten it. They're the ones, if you, they said to us, they sit on the edges of the classroom. They watch for the teacher. You know, teachers have blind spots. They watch for the blind spot and go and sit in it. And when the teacher asks a question, you know, when you ask a question, there's a point where you know who you're going to ask the question. You've seen I've just chosen you. Did you see the moment where I picked you? The moment the teacher asks a question, that's when they put their hands up. This one over here would put the hand up in complete safety of knowing I would never be asking him because I'm already committed to asking the questions here. This is the child whose bag, when you empty it, you would recognise this bag. You empty the bag and the papers are crumpled and not in the folder. The work isn't finished. There's perhaps more than one version of the work and the second one's really barely started. Charming, talkative children who have written themselves off. I'm not very bright. And what we think they need in front of them, it's not a mentor. We said, we know what you want a mentor, don't you? And they said, no, don't send anybody, I'm just thick. I'm past it, I don't want that. But we think what they need in front of them is a great teacher who believes it can be done. Not the teacher who thinks that working class children won't make it. Not the teacher who thinks because you come from an ethnic minority you're bound to be not as good. They need the teacher who still believes it can be done and will drive the point, who will face it out, who won't let the child sit in the corner of the classroom, who brings the child and sits them in front of them and makes them learn, because it requires that level of drive and commitment, because if those children think themselves they can't be rescued, what does that say about the education system? I can tell you, I won't go on, I'll just say that we went and looked at all the children. Would you be surprised to know that some of the children in the blue area who did pass also didn't do very well? Should have done much better than they did. They got C's when really they should have been getting A's. I love this, that when you got the data, you've got to go all the way down. You don't have to believe me, and it might be different in America anyway. I've told you because you can get your schools to do this. You don't have to even have the data. You go and interview these children and ask them what their experience has been of failure, and they will tell you. They were more than willing to tell us, and it was pretty homogenous. One-to-one tuition worked. We came to look at your No Child Left Behind in Australia. Tracking and tacking, we went to look at all the schools that closed the gap between rich and poor. 20 schools had no gaps between rich and poor, primary schools. Went and looked at them all. They all tracked and tacked to the nth degree. They knew exactly what all their children could do. They tacked was the interesting bit, you know, how you respond to that. their head teachers had all been there in excess of 10 years. Not new young, we're very keen on new young guns in England. You know, this clean broom, but that wasn't the case. Good quality of teachers, we think, is the big thing. Not how much you pay them, but whether they're a great teacher or not. Is much more important than class size. If you had a choice between putting your child in a class of 60 with a great teacher or a class of 20 with a weak one, which are you choosing? You should all say the one with 60 and a great teacher. Government were very keen on parent power, but I've not heard anything about it for years now. That kind of got lost. I do wish we knew more about how to close the gaps between rich and poor. And I wish we had better evidence. But can I tell you the truth? We can't afford randomised control trials. They're just too expensive to be running. But we have established a fund, and we send help into schools to design improvements that are valid and can be replicated. I've cantered through a whole lot there of what I think I've learned, and there's much more. And I'm going to hand over to Peter now, who's going to talk about how it has been in his... am I handing over to Peter now?
This is entirely my fault because we've let things move on too long. But I wonder, Sue, if you would mind taking a few questions now, and if Sir Peter will agree to this. We've got some. Let me just explain. Where is that phone ringing? Click on no. Tea party phone.
Yeah, questions?
Let me just take the issues. A couple of issues that we need to deal with. Pasi Sahlberg is leaving here this afternoon to go to Asia. So we really can't delay him too much. So what I'm hoping is we can shorten our lunch hour to about 12:45. If Sir Peter thinks that a half an hour to 45 minutes will handle him, we can then get Pasi on his road in time to catch his plane. So if that's satisfactory, we'll take a few questions and then we'll break for lunch. And instead of giving you an hour and 15 minutes for lunch, you'll be lucky to get 45 minutes. So let's start with the questions. Martin, can we start with you?
Hi, Sue.
Hi.
I'm last night's speaker. That's who referred to. Okay. I have one simple question. You're very into test scores, so you must have discussed in your groups why your TIMSS scores, which seem to be going the same way as your national assessments, are going up for all groups, and why your PISA scores are sinking for all groups over the first 10 years of the 21st century. Did you have these discussions? Do you have some understanding of what is happening there?
They measure different things. I think that would be fair to say, because we have a national curriculum. There is a discrepancy between what the international surveys are looking for and what we have in our own curriculum and our own tests. We have discussed whether we should bring our own tests into line with the kind of application approach that is in those national tests, and decided not to, because this government is very committed to knowledge base rather than the kind of application base of the international tests. We think probably because we have our own system of data, our own tests. People do take that much more seriously in England than the international tests, and this may be a difference here, that we see the international tests as adding to our knowledge of how we compare with the world. And so and we're much more interested in the attitudinal data. So in a way, it's not such a big issue. It doesn't feel like a big issue to us. But I think that the answer to the question you're asking is that we accept that they are measuring different things, and they are measuring the things that, the whole world is measuring itself against, and we accept that difference.
You know, there was an Irish presentation at AERA in San Francisco this past year, and the man said that when they got their big decline in the PISA test, in 2000, I guess in December of 2009, or whenever it appeared, that the country went into a kind of national depression. And I asked them why, and of course then they got their TIMSS results in 2011, and they had gone up. So the country became euphoric. And so if you don't, this is not true, you're saying in England.
I honestly think that it is hellish for 2 days. I wish it was hellish for longer in some ways, because I wish people did more than just look at our rank order. All they want to know is what rank order we are. All this money we spend on it, and everybody's obsessed by whether we're 23rd or 27th. In actual fact, PISA, to be fair on PISA in particular, it does publish a range. It doesn't say this is a score and it's inviolable. I think PISA's pretty open about some of the shortcomings of tests, and publish in a range. And it never looks that alien to us. I think we do think that our performance is not good enough, and that we are probably falling in the world against the Pacific Rim. When we go, we do send people abroad like you do. Shanghai. It's hard to stop our ministers. They could take up residence in Finland. They're there all the time. When we go in, we do. When I went to Shanghai, I thought our kids can't do this. They can do things with square roots there. I can't do. It is impressive. So on the whole, we tend to. I think it's true that it's less of a big issue for us. We accept it's measuring something slightly different, but it's still important. It's a different measure, but it's important.
Tom, let's get a question from you.
I was struck by, you said this during the presentation and you just reiterated it now, that we seem to be moving in opposite directions, our two countries. You're moving from a skills and application-based curriculum to more of a content-based curriculum, and we're moving from a content-based curriculum to more of a skills and application-based curriculum. We may never catch each other.
Maybe there's a point we meet somewhere in the Marianas Trench in the ocean. That is true, and when I look at the Hirsch curriculum in Massachusetts, which is also very purports to be knowledge-based, when you get down to the individual items, I call those process things, particularly in language, not in history. They look like factual things, but in language, they're recognisable to me. So maybe there's not as big a gap between knowledge and skills base as we think. But I think, I hate to say political fashion, but I do think we have cycles in curriculum change.
Fancy that.
Sorry?
Fancy that.
I know.
Okay, one more question.
So,
David.
when we were in England 15 months ago, during your presentation, you made the statement that we found the answer to flagging reading scores, and it's phonics. And then last night, over dinner, you put that into context for us. And could you explain your comment before and the context?
Well, we have phonic wars in England. In England, there's a public scare and a moral panic every 5 years. It comes like the weather. And it goes roughly, phonics, phonics, phonics! And the other side says, whole language, whole language, whole language! And it's fought out, and there's a panic about how reading is taught. And this government, unusually, was elected with a commitment to phonics first and fast as a policy. It was in the manifesto. They were elected to deliver it, and they got a majority. And so we are doing phonics first and fast, pure phonics, synthetic phonics, straight up, hard line, and we're testing at age 6. And it's a no-nonsense test. It's a proper test. It is a test of nonsense words, so they can't possibly have learnt them by sight. We've got monsters who are called Gollop and Quark and
Quango.
Yeah, you got it. You should come to England. You'd be really good at this. That is something the government came with. I was using irony when I said we have the answer, because there is a tendency in those debates that people get polarised very unhelpfully. That phonics is the answer, and of course, in 5 years' time, luckily, the next Labour government that's elected, they'll have another thing. They'll be able to reply and say it wasn't enough. You got it wrong. In fact, one great thing about teachers in England is that they're very pragmatic, and they will take what they have to do and do it, but they won't be the only thing they do. You still have to teach context for comprehension. You still have to expose children to real books and enthusiasm for story so they learn to love literature. But I do think that the evidence in both America and England in research is pretty definitive now that you do have to do phonics. You can do it quickly. It's all over and done in 10, 12 weeks to teach phonics. Synthetic, first and fast saves a lot of time. I believe, I was never the greatest phonics fan, but I've had to put down my weapons and say the evidence is there now.
So the evidence in the United States, as I understand, is that you need to sort of try both. But fortunately, we don't have this phonics war here in this country, and we've never heard of phonics, whole language. Join me in thanking Sue for another wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And we have 45 minutes for lunch, which is being served upstairs.